Hello, welcome to Saturday Service, a podcast all about faith and football with me, Graham Boozy, in association with the Life Strings Churches here in Southend-on-Sea, England. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mr. Ed Jervis. How are you, sir?
I am very good, thank you. Very good. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad at all, thank you. Just to begin with, would you mind just giving a general introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Ed Jervis. I currently am the Content Co-ordinator at UCB and one of the co-hosts of the Big Man Up Top podcast, which is all about faith and football, really, in the sort of intersection between the two. I also wrote and co-host a podcast called Foul Play over the last, it's taken me about 3 years to do, but it finally came out this year, all about the CIA and their potential involvement in the 1970 World Cup, particularly around my grandfather, Gordon Banks, and his mysterious illness in Mexico. So yes, generally, if it's football or faith, I'm all after the stories involved, and that's my passion, really.
I always sort of like to start with getting an idea of what's first sparked your interest in football. Was there a particular moment that you can look back on and think, that was the moment I decided I was quite passionate about the game?
Yeah, well, I'd say, I think sort of growing up in the Banks household, it's just something that is, from the first moment I can remember, football was just around me. You know, I loved playing it, I loved watching it. So I grew up in the 90s, so I remember those really great sort of Man United and Arsenal teams, the sort of Keane, Vieira, Beckham, Scholes, Bergkamp kind of players from the Premier League. But also my family are all huge Stoke City supporters, and so I kind of was dragged into that as well. I remember the moment when I realized that football was something that was sort of really taking a hold of me. It was one year, sort of around, I want to say the late 90s, early 2000s. It was one of Stoke City's promotion pushes out of the third tier. And I remember a really crushing away defeat in the playoffs. And I remember sitting on my kitchen floor sobbing as like an 11-year-old or something like that. I remember my mother walking in and just going, what's the matter? And I said, well, Stoke have lost. That's it. You know, we're out of the playoffs again for another year. And she was like, oh, yeah, come on, Ed. You know, it's football, isn't it? And I said, is this what supporting Stoke City is like? And she said, yes. And I just said, right, okay, fine, I'm in. You know, because like it was the fact that football had done something to me emotionally. It was visceral, it was raw, and I just thought, wow, whether this is good or bad, I don't know, but I want it. So I feel like that was the moment I became a hardened football fan, was at that moment.
Yeah, it's often the suffering that drives the love for the team, unfortunately. Stoke City have obviously been in this sort of mid-table purgatory in the Championship for quite a long time. Do you have any favourite memories, though, from your time following Stoke?
Yeah, I would say lots of lovely memories. I think that's it, is the vast majority of football fans, you know, unless you're supporting one of the teams that is constantly at the top of the Premier League, the vast majority of football fans just experience mostly suffering, don't they? And I think that there's something quite beautiful in that, because it makes the really incredible moments even that more credible. I would say that Stoke have, in my entire life, have only had probably 3 or 4 years where it's been like, oh, this is never going to get any better. And I would say one of those years was the peak Tony Pulis years, sort of around 2010, 2011, getting to an FA Cup final, playing in the Europa League. I would say one moment that really sticks out at me is actually in 2010. I want to say it's winter 2010, home game Stoke City against Birmingham City, which I think we won 2-0. And the second goal in that game was one of the most incredible goals I've ever seen by Ricardo Fuller. And it was just, again, like an emotion that you only get being in the stadium and seeing a wonderful goal at a wonderful time, you know, when your team really needs it. I think every football fan has one of those moments, a goal they remember really fondly. But there's been plenty of those moments. Well, I'd say plenty. There's been enough moments that make it worthwhile, make the suffering worthwhile. Like you say, we are in a bit of a purgatory season. I read somewhere that Stoke are sort of one of the few teams that have essentially finished below mid-table, but not in a relegation battle for something like 8 seasons or 9 seasons on the bounce now. And so, yeah, there's a lot of just mediocrity at our club right now. But hey, surely it's our time coming up soon, right?
You would hope so. You'd hope so. Obviously, you touched on the fact that you've got an incredibly famous grandfather there in Gordon Banks. It might sound like a strange question, but I'm interested to how that impacted the dynamics of family life, because not everyone's got a World Cup winner in their family. And I was just wondering, obviously, you never used to walk in a room and go, hello, World Cup winner, Gordon Banks. It was hi, Grandad. But I just wondered, when did you first become aware, I guess, of your grandfather's achievements?
Yeah, I think again, sort of quite early on, and it's not something that my granddad would have ever said because my granddad was just my granddad to me. But I think, when you're sort of starting to get a grasp of, you're starting to watch World Cups. The first World Cup I remember was France 98 when I would have been about 10. And I watched that World Cup fully aware that my granddad was and still is the only English goalkeeper to have ever won the thing. And so, yeah, you get to a certain age and all of a sudden it is sort of drilled into you, like his achievements. And you can't really, like I say, sort of be in his house without seeing all the stuff on the walls and all of that. We watched, I reckon, the 66 Cup final like probably once a year. So I know that game like the back of my hand. Probably same with the game with Brazil in 1970 with the famous save against Pelé. So yeah, people don't really need to tell you. It's just sort of drilled into you from everything else. I think one of the funny things is that my granddad was just a normal granddad. For anybody that's had a lovely, warm, kind, funny granddad, a big figure in their life, that's basically just the same thing, except that when you'd go out with him, he loved taking us to the cinema. He loved cinema, particularly loved action films and stuff. And so we'd go to the cinema quite a lot, and a lot of people would stop him and chat with him and ask him for his autograph and stuff like that. And so that was weird the first few times that happened, and then you're like, oh, this is just normal. It just takes twice as long to walk anywhere with him.
And just to end on that point, there was an article in the Sentinel about green space near to you that was fenced off. And I appreciate that's not a particularly amusing part of the story, but you mentioned in that article that you used to play football with him and your cousin. I'm just wondering, was he in goal? Because I've just got this image of these two kids desperately trying to score a goal and never having any luck at all.
Well, definitely by that point he was getting on a bit. So he was a man in his 60s by that point, but he was fiercely competitive. So yeah, when he went in goal, he tried to save every shot. He didn't let any go through, slip through his fingers or anything like that. To be honest, he wasn't like a really intense football coach or anything like that. A lot of people sort of imagine that somebody like that might be a born winner. And, he was in respect of his on-pitch achievements. But to be honest, what he wanted from us was just to have a love of the game. And so we would just play and he'd be doing keepy ups and silly things like that. And we'd be trying to tackle him. And he's actually, a lot of people don't know, he was actually quite a good outfielder. Like when he was younger, before he went in goal, he was a winger. So he was quite good with the ball at his feet and he was quite difficult to tackle when he had the ball. So we just had a lot of fun. Do you know what I mean? And I've got so many wonderful memories of just afternoons out on that field that you mentioned, because that's what we would do, particularly in the summer, particularly weather like this. We'd be straight out there. We'd be kicking the ball about. Yes, he'd be trying to teach us things, but more it was just about the love of the game, really. And that's what he translated to me. I will very happily sit here and tell you categorically that footballing ability is not hereditary. A love of the game was definitely passed on to me. I love the stories of the game as well, hence why I do the work that I do. But the skill, it's not quite come down to me.
Don't worry, I'm in the same boat massively. If you could share a tiny bit about your own journey of faith, I'm interested to know when you became a Christian. Were you raised in a Christian household at all?
Yeah. So actually, I would say that my first encounter with God was when I was around about 8 or 9 years old. So my parents were divorced, and in the first part of my childhood, I was living with my dad. Nobody in my family was a Christian. And then my dad came to faith through an Alpha course when I was living with him. And I just remember for about 2 weeks, I just remember something being a bit weird in the home, like not weird in a bad way, but just like, what's dad doing? He's singing a lot and he's, he's listening to, people talk on a cassette tape on the boombox. And I was kind of like, I sort of shrugged it off a little bit. And then basically I remember the day it happened, and football played a huge part in my salvation story as well, is that it was one summer and I was organizing my Panini football stickers, doing that thing where you kind of, you're putting them in piles and you're organizing your swaps and all of that sort of stuff. Well, so I was in the corner of the room doing that, lying on my front on the carpet. And my dad was decorating the room that we were in, and he was listening to a sermon on a cassette tape. And basically, we were there for what feels to me like hours. It was a lovely, lovely afternoon. And then he basically came over to me and sort of sat beside me and just said, Ed, I can't hold this in anymore. I've got to tell you about Jesus. I've encountered Jesus. Would do you want to meet Jesus too? And I don't think I really knew what he meant. But I was like, okay, sure, let's do this. And he showed me how to pray. And I had an incredible encounter with the Holy Spirit and ended up sort of crying into my football stickers for what felt like an hour or so. And just had this incredible, wonderful feeling like I'd met God. And I just felt, I describe it as I feel like God hugged me. It was this, the warm feeling and all of that. But it was more than just a feeling. It was this sense that the creator of the universe had hugged me. And so fast forward, so the rest of my life, I had a bit of I would say problematic is the wrong word, but yeah, a bit of a ropey teenage life. I think lots of us do. And I walked away from God. I never doubt his existence because of that experience that I'd had. But I walked away from God and I came back to Jesus when I was in my sort of early 20s. I just felt this longing to go back to church and to be around God again, essentially. And that's kind of where I suppose my journey sort of really, really took off with Jesus. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's my story.
Are you able to share a short testimony, perhaps, of when your faith has sort of carried you through? It doesn't have to be challenging; it could be positive as well.
I would just say that less sort of about my faith taking me through and more just the sense of my 20s was an odd time, I would say, in my life. And I think lots of people might resonate with this, but I felt in my 20s like I was somebody that was searching for purpose and I was struggling to find it. And I had this relationship with God and I had some good people around me from church and stuff, but I really struggled to sort of find my place in life. I would find myself sort of doing a job for a bit and then learning things and then moving on from it. And yeah, I was sort of just wandering around in life, I would say. And the thing that always struck me was that it very genuinely wasn't until I got to UCB, I got here, where I felt like, this is where God has called me. And the calling on my life was matching up to where I actually was. And I think the thing was that looking back, it's really easy to look at those kind of wilderness years, the wandering in the desert, as wasted time. But for me, I look back and think, I had that job for, 6 months, 9 months. And on the surface, it seems like a big waste. But actually, I learned this skill that helped me here. Or I met this person that gave me this advice. And so I just look back on sort of a bit of a wilderness time in my life and know that God had his hand on me. He was guiding me through that whole time. And that just gives me so much confidence, just a real quiet, assured confidence in knowing that whatever God's got in store for me, I just know that it will be worth it. And wherever he calls me in the next season, I know that he's got it. I know that things are in control. And he's just really reminded me multiple steps along the way that yeah, he's the creator of the universe. He's sovereign and he has a plan and it's a good plan. So I rest in that knowledge and trust that for all my failings, for all my plans that don't work out, that it's okay because he's got it.
And speaking of plans, let's move on to the big man up top. Probably the finest Christian football podcast out there. It's absolutely brilliant, this, and highly recommended. You mentioned that you joined UCB in 2019. Did you have aspirations for journalism or did you join for other reasons?
So I absolutely love radio. Radio is this incredible tool to communicate one message to lots of people. It's broadcasting. The definition of broadcasting is, scattering the seeds far and wide. But the thing that I'm excited about podcasts is that basically that's narrowcasting. That is taking this message and packaging it in such a way that this very specific audience, often a much smaller audience, but this specific audience can connect with it and can connect with it in such a way that they're more engaged than simply listening to a radio show. And so, yeah, Joe and I wanted to create the big man up top, but with some real purpose. We wanted it to be more than just, two Christian blokes talking about football. Some days that is a bit what it is, but actually the whole idea is that we wanted to connect with a community. We know from the countless emails we've had that our listeners are people, often men, but not always men, but people who maybe are struggling to find a community. They probably go to church, or they might go to church, but maybe they're struggling to really find their crowd. And actually, they find more of their crowd in the terraces on a Saturday at 3 o'clock. But then there's parts of that which jar with them. Maybe it's the aggression or the violence or the drinking culture or the betting or whatever it is. And so they sort of don't really feel at home anywhere. And so our mission was to create a space where we could bring Jesus into the football conversation. We could chat about football. We could talk about Arsenal bottling it, although, obviously they didn't last year. We could talk about that, but we could bring Jesus into those conversations as well, and just say, what do we think Jesus would be saying in this conversation? Because I think he would have a lot to say about it. Some of it to do with, the minor points, the funny points, the brilliant points, and then some of the sort of more difficult moral and ethical issues as well. Our aim is to always just bring Jesus into the football conversation, really. That's what we try and do.
You spoke of audience there, but in my opinion, I think the tone and the content of the show would actually appeal to quite a secular audience as well. And I wondered if there was any intention in that, or is it just natural?
Yeah, I think that is another aspect of it. I think, look, there are an awful lot of football podcasts out there. If you are a non-Christian just looking for a football podcast, you're not likely to come to the Big Man Up Top, because you've got a whole host of other stuff, the likes of, Football Ramble and Cliches and Guardian Football Weekly and all that sort of stuff. But I think that there are a lot of people out there who may be exploring faith, may find parts of that football culture a bit jarring, and may be like, oh, I don't know, something doesn't sit quite right with me here. And possibly they're exploring faith, and this is a way that they can do it. This is a sort of an entry door, if you like, into that conversation about Jesus. I think there's a significant portion of our listeners are Christians and are looking for additional community to join in with, and that's also great. But I think you're right. We do frame our conversation in such a way that you could listen to it and could share a discussion with your non-Christian friend, and it hopefully feel fairly natural. We never like to pretend like we know all the answers. That's a big part of it as well, is that, if we're sort of hashing out a point or a big point of debate, we want to always feel like we're just exploring this with the listener. And that's why you'll hear a lot of the time we'll go, right, what do we think about this? Let's have a look at the Bible. Does the Bible have any answers? I don't know. It might do. It might not be talking about VAR. It probably doesn't. But there are probably verses that could help us talk about, some of the issues of morality within the game. And so, yeah, I think that we're aiming for people of no faith or of other faiths to at least feel like they can join in the conversation. They can be part of the conversation, and they can hear us naturally bring Jesus into that conversation as well.
And it must be quite encouraging to see the increasing displays of faith within football. I mean, you did a lot of content around the World Cup, and that for me felt like a bit of a watershed moment. And I was just wondering how encouraging that is for you and your show.
Massively, because I think for so many years while I was growing up as a football fan, you didn't see those displays of faith. You might see the odd player point to the sky, but you didn't know whether that was somebody referring to God or to Jesus, or whether that was a relative who'd passed on, or it was all very sort of cryptic if it was there at all. And actually, we have seen a remarkable shift in just the last 5, not even 10 years. It's been so recent, where all of a sudden players are being emboldened to share their faith on the pitch, which is just absolutely incredible. And you see in the kind of comments, on things like Twitter and Instagram, like non-church, non-Christian people talking about this display of faith and saying, what do we think of that? And broadly, it's really overwhelmingly positive. We talked in one of our latter shows, I think it was Joe and Tom in my absence recently on the Big Man Up Top. We're talking about the huge Crystal Palace account that tweeted about how great it was to see England's players and France's players praying together, because he, as a Crystal Palace fan, knew how important it was for his team to have that shared faith when they had all those players together, and they won the FA Cup. And so it's that thing of like, it's showing the world that this is a positive thing, this is a positive impact. And actually, like, faith and religion has not always had that reputation. But thankfully, people are able to see, these incredible guys who are in the limelight, and women as well in the women's game, are able to display their faith and show how important it is for them. And it's a loving act of declaring who they are. And I just think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. It's only going to continue to grow. And it's just going to become part of the conversation around football. It's just going to, as more and more players do it, more younger players will feel emboldened to also share their faith as well. So it's just going to become so natural. And my prayer is that when this becomes commonplace, is that we don't stop talking about it, because it'll be really easy to go, there's another player again, pointing to the sky. We need to make sure we keep talking about this, because I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, for sure. Just quickly touch upon Foul Play, which was quite the undertaking, but an absolutely magnificent podcast, really enthralling story. There seemed to be twist after twist. I'm not going to throw any spoilers out there, but if you could just share a little bit about that project. So what the original intention was and where it took you.
Yeah, well, I think anybody who listens to Foul Play will get that the journey is very much sort of playing out in real time almost. What happened was that my understanding of the World Cup in 1970 was that my grandfather fell ill just before the quarterfinal against West Germany. And yeah, he had food poisoning. It was awful. It was so bad he could barely stand up. It was deemed that he couldn't play. So he didn't play in the quarterfinal, and England got knocked out. And that kind of began the sort of, I don't like using the word curse because I don't believe in them, but it began the sort of the curse of English football, if that makes sense. The 30s, 40, 50, 60 years of hurt, we think of since 66. And so, yeah, I'd always just seen it, and my whole family had always just seen it as, well, just one of those unlucky things that happens, unfortunately. And it was such a shame that it happened to my granddad, but, we'll never know what could have been. My granddad always used to say something dodgy went on in Mexico, and he didn't know what, and he never mentioned what. He would just say, I don't know, but I ate the same thing as all the rest of my team. I drank the same thing as all the rest of my team. Why did I get so ill and nobody else did? And so we kind of just sort of shrugged it off and just thought, all right, granddad, yeah, fine, whatever, and didn't really think much of it. And then after he died, I was having dinner with my family. It's for my birthday in 2023. And somebody was at that dinner who was a close family friend of ours, a guy called Don Mullen, who was a sort of an author and a journalist himself. And he said something to the effect of, did you ever hear about what really happened to your granddad in Mexico? And I went, what do you mean? And he said, well, the CIA got to him. I've picked up my jaw off the dining table at that point. But he's then promptly sort of explained this theory that it was all to do with the US supporting the Brazilian regime, and a good way to support them was to help Brazil win the World Cup. And so essentially the US and the CIA embarked on a sabotage mission against the England team, including things like the Bobby Moore Bogota bracelet scandal, which happened just before the World Cup. And so he gave me enough that made me think, gosh, what if that's true? And I didn't really believe it, I suppose. But I was more just intrigued as to I wonder if we could find out more. And so I met a bit of a chance meeting. I met Gabriel Gatehouse, the investigative journalist, at a conference. And I had a big conversation with him and just sort of said, what do you think of this crazy story? And he said, yeah, sounds crazy. And he was way more skeptical than I was, but he just thought, well, what's the harm in looking? And as he told me later, he thoroughly expected to debunk this story in a couple of days. He went away, started digging, and, weeks later he called me and just said, I don't know if it's true, but I think there could be something to this. So why don't we go on this journey together and figure it out? And that's basically what we did. We traveled to Mexico to go and explore the hotel where the England team was staying in Guadalajara. We went to the National Archives of the Mexican Secret Police in Mexico City. Gabriel and our producer Alex went on a journey to go and uncover the archives of a former senator from Missouri, who's a key part of the story as well. We've done all sorts, been in archives in 3 separate countries to really, try and seriously investigate this wild, crazy story. And essentially, again, like you say, without giving it away, I'd love people to go and listen to it if they haven't already. But just this idea that maybe this happened. And actually, the journey is so wild, and it was far beyond what we were expecting. I think even for me, somewhere in the back of my mind, I was expecting it to be over quite quickly. And I think sort of more than the actual investigation itself, what it sort of turned into for me was this real almost pilgrimage to kind of find something out for my granddad, something that confused him in his life. That's in the end what I really wanted to do, was to sort of see if I could find something out for him. And so, yeah, it was a wonderful journey. One of the best experiences of my life, actually, traveling around, doing all this investigative work, learning a lot of things along the way. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I think that comes out in the podcast as well. It's a fun ride. So yeah, I'd encourage people to go and have a listen to Foul Play if they haven't already.
Of course, available on any of your preferred podcast platforms, as is the Big Man Up Top. Big Man Up Top is also on YouTube, where you can see their lovely faces, should you wish to listen to them too. Head to @BigManUpTopPod on Instagram to give them a follow, and head to ucb.co.uk to find out more about Ed's station, @Saturday Service Football on Instagram and Facebook, or @FaithAndFooty on X, should you wish to follow myself, and www.livestreams.org.uk to find out more about my church. Mr. Ed Jervis, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Graham. And quickly, just to say, keep up all the amazing work that you're doing as well with Saturday Service. And it's so vital that we keep sharing these messages. So yeah, it's great to be on. It's so good to meet you and to chat with you. Really appreciate it.